Darkness stretched across the silent corridors of the abandoned space station, its metal husk floating in the void like a forgotten tomb. The Excelcar expedition team moved cautiously, their bioluminescent eyes scanning the walls covered in strange, unreadable inscriptions. Their leader, High Scholar Valen, stepped forward, his 6 limbs moving with calculated precision as he reached the final chamber, the one they had been warned never to enter. The warning had been simple. It had been spoken in 100 different tongues across the galaxy, carried through the ages like a whisper of an ancient curse. Never wake the humans. But warnings were for the weak. The Excelcar were scholars, scientists, seekers of truth. Myths and legends held no power over those who wielded knowledge. And yet, standing before the towering black door, reinforced with an alloy their scanners couldn't identify, even Valen felt something that no scientist should ever feel. Doubt. Is this wise? One of his subordinates asked, their voice hushed despite the vast emptiness surrounding them. Valen did not answer immediately. His 6 fingers traced the door's surface, feeling a faint vibration. The energy readings from within were erratic, flickering between nothingness and something his instruments refused to define. There was life in there, but it was old, dormant, waiting. He turned to the others. We did not travel this far to turn back at the doorstep of history. With a swift motion, he activated the decryption module, feeding it every known algorithm in the galactic database. The door resisted, its ancient mechanisms refusing to yield. It took minutes, long, agonizing minutes, but then, with a sudden hiss, the airlock depressurized, releasing a breath of time itself. The chamber beyond was unlike anything they had expected. Massive pods, sleek and metallic, lined the walls in symmetrical rows. Each was covered in thick layers of frost, preserved in the cold silence of the void. Inside them, shapes were barely visible, humanoid figures, still as statues. A deep hum pulsed through the air, the sound of machines that had been working tirelessly for untold centuries. This was no graveyard. This was a prison. Valen's mandibles clicked in excitement. We have found them. The others hesitated, unease creeping into their movements. There was something unsettling about the stillness of the place, the way the air itself felt heavier, pressing against their chests. The Excelcar had studied countless species, dissected 1,000 forms of life. But this was different. One of the scientists approached a nearby console, its screen flickering with unreadable text. This language, it predates our records. Valen barely heard him. His focus was on the nearest pod, where a single figure stood out among the rest. The ice had begun to thaw, revealing a face unlike any they had seen before. Sharp features, a strong jawline, and eyes that remained closed, but carried the weight of an entire era. With the press of a button, the pod systems flared to life. Steam hissed from the seals as warm air flooded the chamber. For the first time in 1,000 years, the human inside took a breath. Then, a sound echoed through the station. A voice. It wasn't spoken in any language that Excelcar knew, yet they understood it perfectly. You should not have done this. The lights flickered. The machines rumbled. And in the silence that followed, the first human's eyes snapped open. A sharp gasp shattered the silence. A deep, ragged breath, one that had been held for centuries, tore through the chamber as the human's eyes snapped open. For a long moment, he didn't move, his body frozen in the stiffness of deep stasis. Then his fingers twitched. His chest rose and fell in controlled, measured breaths. The Excelcar recoiled instinctively, their bioluminescent markings dimming in fear. None of them had ever seen a human before. Not truly. The species was a relic of history, a mystery wrapped in myth. They were supposed to be extinct, wiped out in some forgotten war that had left only whispers of their existence. And yet, here one stood, flesh and blood, rising from the grave as if time itself had bent to his will. High Scholar Valen watched, breathless. His logical mind told him this was simply a biological reaction, a body reawakening after an extended period of suspended animation. And yet, something about this was wrong. Something about the way the air in the room had changed, growing heavier, thicker with an unseen force. The human exhaled slowly, his head tilting forward, eyes locking onto the unfamiliar creatures before him. They were tall, insectoid, their elongated limbs shifting with nervous energy. He remained still, assessing, calculating. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power in the room. Valen forced himself to step forward, careful not to show weakness. "Can you understand me?" he asked, his voice careful, measured. For a moment, nothing. Then the human moved. His hand lifted, brushing over the frost on his stasis pod. His fingers curled into a fist, and the Excelcar noticed how strong he looked, even after centuries of sleep. Muscles that should have withered remained firm. Eyes that should have been hazy with confusion were sharp and aware. "Yes," the human finally said, his voice low, edged with something dangerous. "I can understand you." The Excelcar flinched. The voice was deeper than they expected, filled with something ancient, something hardened by war. Valen straightened. "My name is High Scholar Valen of the Excelcar Dominion. We are an advanced scientific race, dedicated to uncovering the mysteries of the past. You were locked away for reasons unknown to us. We seek knowledge, not conflict." The human studied him. The way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders squared. It was the body language of a predator sizing up prey. "You woke me up," he said finally. Valen hesitated. "Yes." The human's gaze flickered past him, scanning the chamber. More pods lined the walls, each filled with more humans, frozen in time. His expression darkened. That was a mistake. Valen's mandibles clicked in frustration. Why? A deep rumble shook the station. The lights overhead flickered, and somewhere beyond the chamber, alarms began to blare. The Excelcar turned in confusion, their comm units lighting up with panicked voices from the expedition members stationed outside. "Sir, something is coming. The sensors just detected a massive energy spike. It's a fleet. An unknown fleet just dropped out of FTL." Valen stiffened. "Impossible. We detected no ships in the sector." The human didn't react with confusion. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, as if this was expected. "They followed the signal," he muttered. Valen turned back to him, his chest tightening. "What do you mean?" The human stepped forward, and the Excelcar instinctively stepped back. He rolled his shoulders, flexing his fingers, testing his body after centuries of stillness. "The vault wasn't just a prison," he said. "It was a warning beacon, a failsafe." His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Valen. "The second you opened it, you told them exactly where we are." The alarms grew louder. Outside, the deep void of space burned as an enemy force emerged from the darkness. Panic spread through the Excelcar expedition like wildfire. The once quiet halls of the station filled with frantic voices as researchers and security personnel scrambled for answers. Outside, in the vast emptiness of space, the unknown fleet loomed, their ships massive and predatory. Their hulls bore no recognizable insignia, no identifying marks of any known faction. These were not traders nor explorers. They were hunters. High Scholar Valen's mandibles clicked in distress as his comm unit buzzed with incoming reports. The orbital sentries had been the first to detect the threat, but now the entire station was on high alert. Massive energy signatures, advanced weapons, incoming assault ships. "They aren't responding to our hails," one of the officers reported. "They're charging weapons." Valen turned sharply to the human. The man stood tall, his expression unreadable, his muscles tensed as he listened. He showed no signs of fear, no panic, only the calculating patience of someone who had seen this before. "You knew this would happen," Valen accused, his voice rising. "Who are they?" The human didn't answer immediately. His gaze flickered to the pods surrounding them, to the still frozen forms of his kind. His fingers curled into fists. "They're the reason we were put here," he said at last. "And now that you've woken us, they've come to finish what they started." The words sent a ripple of unease through the Excelcar. Valen's breath caught in his throat. If this was true, if this enemy had once fought humans and survived, then they were dealing with a force powerful enough to nearly wipe out an entire species. The comms crackled again. "High Scholar, they've launched boarding crafts. They'll breach the station in minutes." Valen turned toward his team. "Seal the vault. We must evacuate." But the human spoke over him, voice steady, firm. "No. You run now, you die." Valen hesitated. The authority in the human's tone was unsettling, commanding in a way no Excelcar leader had ever been. "Then what do you suggest?" The human glanced at the control panel beside his stasis pod. It was ancient, but his fingers moved across it as if he had last used it yesterday. Screens flickered to life, diagnostic scans running through systems long thought dead. "You freed one of us," he said. "But if you want to survive, you're going to need more." A single press of a button, and the entire vault trembled. The frozen pods hissed, their containment fields failing as dormant systems surged back online. Steam flooded the chamber as locks disengaged, releasing dozens of humans from their centuries-long sleep. The Excelcar flinched as the first figures stumbled forward, dazed but recovering far too quickly. These were not weaklings lost to time. These were warriors, soldiers of a forgotten war, waking into battle once more. One of them, a woman with cropped black hair and a deep scar running down her cheek, turned to the first human, her voice hoarse but steady. "Drake," she said, recognizing him. "Status." The first human, Drake, looked at her and then at the others as they regained their bearings. He turned back to Valen, eyes cold and resolute. "You woke us up. Now let's see if you deserve to survive." Beyond the chamber walls, the enemy ships locked onto the station. The attack had begun. The station trembled as the first impact struck, shaking its ancient foundations. Lights flickered, alarms howled, and the distant sound of metal groaning under pressure sent a ripple of fear through the Excelcar crew. The enemy had arrived, and they weren't waiting for an invitation. Valen's limbs twitched in panic as he struggled to maintain control over the situation. His people were scientists, not warriors. They had no standing army, no trained soldiers. They relied on technology and diplomacy to protect them. Against a force like this, one that did not speak, did not negotiate, they were utterly helpless. But the humans were not. Drake moved with cold efficiency, scanning the room as the others from the pods finished waking. The soldiers, his soldiers, were still shaking off centuries of stasis, their bodies stiff, but their minds sharp. The woman who had first spoken to him, Lieutenant Sloan, was already issuing orders, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had done this before. "Head count," she snapped. "Weapons check. Systems online." A younger soldier, barely out of his 20s when he had been frozen, cracked his neck as he examined his pod's control panel. "We're at 70% operational capacity. Cryo-sickness is minimal. We can fight." Drake's gaze flickered to Valen, who was still struggling to process what was happening. "What kind of defenses does this station have?" The scholar hesitated. "Minimal. We weren't expecting an attack." Drake exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. "Of course you weren't." He turned back to his people. "All right. First order of business, securing this station. We can't fight them in space, not yet. We make them come to us, control the battlefield." The humans began moving immediately. It was like watching a machine react to a pre-programmed sequence. No hesitation, no confusion. They adapted instantly. One of the Excelcar scientists watched in horror as a soldier pried open a maintenance panel and pulled out a bundle of exposed wiring. What are you doing?" "Rigging the power grid," the soldier answered without looking up. "We can overload the conduits in the docking bay. fry their boarding equipment before they can breach the inner decks. Another human had already found a security drone and was manually reprogramming it. Your automated defenses are weak, but the targeting systems are decent. If I tweak the response settings, we can use them for suppressive fire. Valen couldn't believe what he was seeing. You've been awake for less than 10 minutes. How are you already organizing a counterattack? Drake shot him a look that made his mandibles click shut. Because that's what we were made for. Another explosion rocked the station, and the comms crackled with desperate voices. They've breached the outer hull. They're moving toward the main corridors. Drake turned to his people. All right, time's up. Defensive positions. Sloan, take a team and hold engineering. Carter, get those drones online. Everyone else with me. We make them pay for every step they take. The humans dispersed like a shadow falling over the station, moving with purpose, their bodies still adjusting but their minds already locked into the reality of war. Valen swallowed hard as he watched them vanish into the corridors, their footsteps eerily silent. The XL car had woken them expecting knowledge, expecting history. Instead, they had awoken something far more dangerous. The first screams echoed through the station as the invaders breached the hull. The XL car, unused to war, had no words to describe the horror of what came next. Shadows poured through the corridors, tall, armored figures moving with unnatural grace, their weapons humming with lethal energy. They did not speak, did not hesitate. They simply advanced, their black visors reflecting the station's dim emergency lights. Valen had seen death before, but never like this. The first cell car security officers who tried to resist were cut down instantly. Energy bolts punched through their chitinous bodies as if their armor was nothing but paper. Those who tried to flee were just as unlucky, pinned against walls by razor-thin blades or shot in the back with mechanical precision. The enemy moved like ghosts, efficient, cold, unstoppable. And then the humans struck back. The first explosion shook the station as the power conduits in the docking bay detonated, sending arcs of electricity surging through the metal walls. Sparks rained down, and several of the invaders convulsed as the overload fried their systems, their suits locking up before their bodies collapsed in heaps of dead weight. From the shadows, Drake and his soldiers emerged. They moved with practiced efficiency, slipping through cover, using the station's narrow corridors to their advantage. Unlike the Hell car, who had panicked, the humans didn't run. They didn't hesitate. They didn't fear. Drake fired first. His stolen cell car plasma rifle let out a sharp hiss as a bolt of blue energy ripped through the air, striking one of the invaders in the chest. The enemy staggered back, its armor absorbing part of the impact. But that was all Drake needed. He lunged forward, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Before the enemy could recover, Drake's fist crashed into its visor. The reinforced glass shattered. A sickening crunch followed as his second strike caved in the creature's throat. It collapsed without a sound. Sloan and her team were just as brutal. They fought up close, using whatever they could find. Reprogrammed drones, makeshift explosives, even their own bare hands. They moved like hunters reclaiming stolen ground, tearing through the invaders with merciless precision. The enemy had come expecting a slaughter. Instead, they had walked into a war they didn't understand. Valen watched from behind cover, his mind reeling. This wasn't just fighting. This was something else entirely. The humans were adapting. They picked up fallen weapons, learned enemy patterns in seconds, turned every disadvantage into an advantage. The invaders had superior numbers, better technology. But it didn't matter, because the humans had something far worse. Instinct. One of the enemy commanders barked orders in a guttural, synthetic voice, rallying its troops. They tried to regroup, pushing forward with heavy suppressive fire. Plasma bolts burned through the air, melting through walls and panels. Drake didn't flinch. Sloan, push left. Carter dropped them when they breached the corner. No hesitation, no wasted movements. The moment the enemy rounded the bend, Carter unleashed a volley of stolen drone fire, tearing through the lead soldiers. Sloan's squad surged forward, knives flashing, guns blazing. The invaders never stood a chance. Within minutes, the corridor was littered with bodies. But they weren't human bodies. Drake exhaled, reloading his rifle. His gaze swept over the carnage before locking onto Valen, who was still frozen in shock. "You still don't get it, do you?" Drake muttered, stepping past him. "This isn't just a fight." The lights flickered again. More alarms blared. From the upper levels of the station, the enemy was regrouping, preparing for another wave. Drake adjusted his grip on his rifle. His eyes were cold. This is a wake-up call. The station was bleeding. Fire and smoke filled the corridors as the invaders pushed deeper, relentless despite their losses. The Xelokar were in full retreat, their scientists and officers scrambling to escape the carnage. Valen had never seen his kind like this, once so confident in their superiority, now reduced to frightened creatures scurrying for survival. But the humans? The humans stood their ground. Drake moved through the chaos with practiced ease, his rifle steady, his eyes scanning for weaknesses. The enemy had learned now. They weren't underestimating the resistance anymore. Their formations were tighter, their tactics more aggressive. The moment one of their soldiers fell, another took its place, pushing forward with mechanical precision. They were trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer attrition, but they didn't understand humans. Sloan ducked behind a collapsed bulkhead, wiping blood from her forehead. "They're adapting," she muttered, "but not fast enough." Drake smirked, his voice calm despite the war raging around him. "Then we keep hitting them where it hurts." The Xelokar High Scholar was still in shock, watching as the battle unfolded before him. He had studied war in theory, read about strategies, understood the logic of combat. But this was something else. The humans weren't fighting with calculations and formulas. They were fighting with raw survival instincts, pushing past exhaustion, past pain, past any logical limit. They fought because it was in their blood. "Drake," Carter's voice crackled through the comms. "They've cut off the lower levels, reinforcements incoming." Drake didn't hesitate. "Then we take the fight to them." He grabbed a fallen enemy's sidearm and tossed it to Sloan. She caught it midair, already firing before it had fully settled in her grip. The humans worked together, seamlessly, as if they had never been apart. Valen forced himself to move, his limbs stiff. "We need to retreat to the escape shuttles." Drake barely spared him a glance. "And go where?" "They'll just follow. You think this is an isolated attack? They came to erase us. They're not leaving loose ends." Valen's breath hitched. He had known, deep down, that these invaders were not ordinary raiders, but extermination. He looked around again. The bodies of the enemy littered the floor, but so did the bodies of his own kind. If the humans hadn't fought back, the Xelokar would already be extinct. A deep hum filled the air, making the walls tremble. The humans stiffened, their senses attuned to danger in a way the Xelokar could never match. "They're powering something up," Sloan muttered, her grip tightening on her weapon. Drake's expression darkened. "It's not just an attack. They're prepping a station kill shot." Valen's stomach dropped. "You mean?" "They're going to overload the reactor," Drake finished. "They'll blow the whole place, take us all with it." Valen's mandibles clicked in horror. That would kill their own forces. Drake nodded grimly. "And they don't care. They just want to make sure we're dead." Silence fell over the group for half a second. Then, without hesitation, Drake turned to his soldiers. "Change of plans. We're not just surviving this." He glanced up at the enemy forces converging on their position. "We're ending it." The Xelokar scientist's breath caught in his throat. You're going to fight them." Drake reloaded his rifle with a sharp click. "Not fight." His gaze burned with something ancient, something primal. "We're going to win." In the aftermath of battle, silence reigned over the battered station, a silence filled with the heavy weight of change. The enemy, once so confident and relentless, lay scattered like broken dreams across scorched metal corridors. The humans stood amidst the ruin, their weapons still smoking, their expressions hard and resolute. Drake, bloodied but unbowed, surveyed the scene with a quiet determination. This was more than survival. It was a new beginning forged in the crucible of war. The enemy's fleet, now retreating into the endless darkness of space, left behind only echoes of regret and shattered technology. A single enemy commander, barely clinging to life, had managed to transmit a final desperate message, a warning that reverberated in the minds of those who had fought. "We should have left you sleeping." Those words, bitter and foreboding, were carried by the wind through the ruined station and seared into the memory of every soul present. Among the survivors, the cell car moved slowly, their earlier arrogance replaced by a trembling realization. Valen, the once unyielding scholar, now appeared diminished, a creature humbled by the ferocity of human instinct. He lingered on the threshold of the control room, where he had once proudly displayed his species' technological marvels, now reduced to relics in a battlefield. His thoughts churned with regret and the unspoken knowledge that their hubris had cost them dearly. Drake stepped forward, his eyes locking with Valen's in a moment heavy with unspoken understanding. "This is the cost of meddling with forces beyond our control," he said in a measured tone that held both sorrow and resolve. "You woke us, and now you must learn the consequences." The humans began methodically securing the station, clearing debris, and salvaging what they could from the remains of enemy technology. Their movements were deliberate and efficient, not out of malice, but from a desire to ensure that such a threat would never again be allowed to rise unchecked. Each fallen comrade, whether human or alien, became a solemn reminder of the price of negligence. And yet, amid the devastation, there was a flicker of hope, a realization that out of chaos, a new order could emerge. In the central chamber, where the first human had awoken centuries ago, Drake gathered his closest allies. He spoke in a voice that resonated with authority and unyielding conviction. "Today, we reclaim not only our place, but also our destiny. The enemy's aggression ends here. We will rebuild, we will learn, and we will rise. Let this station be the birthplace of a new era, a future where we decide our fate, not the whims of fate itself." As his words echoed through the vast emptiness, the humans began to form a plan. They would repair the damage, repurpose the station's ancient systems, and establish a bastion, a stronghold of resilience against any who would dare to challenge them again. Valen, still grappling with his failures, approached Drake with cautious humility. Perhaps we can work together," he murmured, his voice tinged with regret. "There is knowledge here, and there is wisdom in your ways. Let us combine what we know to forge a better future." Drake regarded him coolly, the scars of battle etched into his face. Yet behind that hardened exterior was a willingness to see beyond old rivalries. "This is not about trust," he replied slowly. "It's about survival. And if your people can help us secure that, then you have a place among us. But know this, betrayal will not be forgiven." In that solemn exchange, an unspoken pact was forged. The humans and the XL car, once separated by pride and ancient enmities, now faced a common future. The station, scared by the violence of the day, stood as a monument to the lessons learned, that some forces should never be awakened lightly, and that every action has consequences that ripple through time. As the stars shone silently beyond the station's shattered windows, the new alliance began its work, determined to ensure that the horrors of the past would not dictate the future. In the cold expanse of space, amid echoes of regret and hope, a new era was being written, one where the human spirit, tempered by war and forged in adversity, would lead the charge into a destiny all their own.